Good afternoon, everybody. This is a live extreme weather briefing with a lot to talk about as we have a tropical wave that is just to the southwest of Hispaniola, to the southeast of Jamaica. That forecast models are showing it to head off to the west-northwest, possibly between Cuba and the Yucatan Peninsula, potentially entering into the Gulf of Mexico in about 3 to 5 days, and even approaching the central Gulf Coast, potentially as a formidable hurricane Delta, even a strong hurricane. Some of those models are showing intensification into a major hurricane. But of course, it's still way too early to panic or even take any action. This is the second tropical wave. As we discussed yesterday, we had Tropical Storm Gamma that was nearing hurricane strength. As it was approaching the Yucatan, it did move out over land, weakened a bit, and now it is located over the southern Gulf of Mexico, and hurricane reconnaissance aircraft are indicating maximum sustained winds of about 60 miles an hour, but it does continue to weaken. And in fact, the last Hurricane Hunter pass showed that it continues to weaken with those low-level winds of about 50 miles an hour. And Gamma is supposed to meander west and then maybe southwest into the Bay of Campeche, but there's a ton of uncertainty with Gamma. Even a couple of forecast models are taking Gamma back north as a reinvigorated tropical cyclone later on the week. A lot of it also depends on how this tropical wave that will eventually likely become Tropical Cyclone Delta is going to interact with Gamma and Delta in the southern Gulf of Mexico. Very likely Gamma could just weaken and kind of get buried into the Bay of Campeche, opening the door for Hurricane Delta to intensify once it reaches the Gulf of Mexico. And I do think that similar to how we've seen many of these tropical cyclones, the genesis of these cyclones take place so far this year, it seems like they're going to wait and intensify until they reach the Gulf of Mexico. Hurricane Laura, even Tropical Cyclone Marco that eventually nearly died before making landfall in southern Louisiana. Also Hurricane Sally that formed just offshore of Florida, passed over the very southern tip of Florida, and then gradually intensified, even reaching Category 2 strength once when it only had a pressure in the upper 980s, which was definitely unusual, almost looking like a large supercell storm. And then eventually, once it moved a little bit further west, that wind shear subsided and then allowed for unimpeded intensification in the Gulf of Mexico. And I think that with Gamma, there's a lot of dry air across the western and northern Gulf of Mexico. And by this tropical cyclone just meandering over here, it's almost acting to moisten and allow the whole entire Gulf of Mexico basin to gain more of a tropical type of a profile instead of this very dry, subtropical, even continental type of an air mass that happened with that cold front surging south through the western Gulf of Mexico and eventually into the Bay of Tehuantepec, encouraging a formation of a Central American gyre. That's what these tropical cyclones are very loosely associated with, even though these tropical waves came off of Africa, arrived here in the Western Caribbean at about the same time as a Kelvin wave, an area of enhanced convection. But it looks like at least we're going to get a couple of tropical cyclones out of this pattern, maybe a third down the line with another tropical wave approaching. But really the one to watch is what could be Tropical Cyclone Gamma. We still need to watch, or Tropical Cyclone Delta, but we still need to watch Gamma as it meanders in the southern Gulf of Mexico into the Bay of Campeche for a potential northward turn and a potential 1-2 punch in the Gulf of Mexico. But the steering currents that are going to impact Delta looks like a trough is going to lift off the east coast, and that's going to allow the Bermuda High to build back to the west across the northern Gulf of Mexico. That's a pattern that we've seen happen way too much this year, and that's led to a lot of negative situations along the Gulf of Mexico and a lot of hurricane landfalls out there. So it looks like the western building of this Bermuda High is going to steer Tropical Cyclone Delta further west and possibly right between Cuba and the Yucatan and potentially into the central Gulf of Mexico. But really, anybody along the Gulf Coast needs to keep a close eye on this pattern. Definitely no reason to panic. A lot of scenarios still could happen, one of which could be no landfalls of any tropical cyclones across the U.S., but I do think that the potential is increasing for Gamma to be, or for Delta and Gamma to honestly be a pretty substantial problem. And I'm also going to talk about the fall tornado season. I know that all eyes are on the tropical season right now because of what a record breaker it's been. And it even seems like over recent years we've had kind of a lull in the fall season for tornado potential, aside from the tornado threat that impacted the Dallas-Fort Worth metro last year at around Halloween that I was chasing. But this video right here is actually from Tipton, Oklahoma. That's November 7, 2011. Coincidentally, 2011 was one of the most active springs in recorded history, with April of 2011 being the most active month in recorded history for tornadoes. And that, not non-coincidentally, was also the last significant La Nina event that persisted through the cold season and into the spring, leading to more of a progressive, consolidated upper-level mid-latitude jet, and that, in part, contributed to the development of the super outbreak from April 25th to 27, 2011. It looks like this upcoming spring could be another La Nina spring, which doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be incredibly active across Dixie Alley, but I do think that the later spring could be quite active in Dixie. Usually during El Nino years, Dixie Alley will get active earlier in the spring, later winter, but then those La Ninas a lot of times will get delayed a little bit later in the spring. But a lot of times those outbreaks are even more substantial across Dixie Alley. This one was fall of 2011, one of the most prolific tornado outbreaks I've ever chased during the fall. One of the other big events, October 4, 1998, was actually the first tornado I ever intercepted, and that was during the most substantial fall outbreak ever in the state of Oklahoma. And I actually missed the best tornado that day, which was near the Dover, Oklahoma area. I was looking east from I-35 from Perry, Oklahoma at the supercell that was closing in on Stillwater. Saw two tornadoes directly next to each other. And another big fall event that I chased, October 9, 2011. Another big one was in 2013, November 7, across Illinois, Indiana, Ohio. That was a mega outbreak. Also saw those two tornadoes right next to each other. One of those tornadoes was an EF4 tornado near Washington, Illinois. But this one right here was Tipton, Oklahoma. We had Dominator 2 out in the field. There you can see the late, great Andy Gabrielson's SUV that had rolled on its side there, trying to get up close to that tornado. We came up and picked up Andy, got him in the back of the car, resumed the chase, and saw more tornadoes on this day. We were in the Dominator here. Dick McGowan was driving. Had a great team out there on this day, came very close. This was actually punching through the hail core, so I was trying to do a hook slice maneuver going west to east through that hook. Still didn't have visual of the tornado at this time. I knew that there was a tornado in progress based on radar, and then as soon as we got through that thin veil of hail and rain that was wrapping around the backside of the supercell and the hook echo, we saw this massive stovepipe looking off to the south-southeast. And this is why I love doing the hook slice maneuver, because you can angle just to the north of where the tornado is, punch through the hook, and then you look off to the south and you see this incredible contrast and incredible coloration with the sun illuminating the condensation funnel. You also have the red dirt out there in southwest, southern Oklahoma. That's so common out there. And this tornado was rated an EF4 back then. And the crazy thing is that night there was a 5.2 earthquake. So I was seeing the lightning from the convection, or the MCS, that had formed in western Oklahoma. And there was a major earthquake that night in Oklahoma. And many have said is related to fracking out there, but a substantial earthquake. And earlier that fall, also I was watching the low-scoring LSU-Alabama game. It was like 3-6. And there was a big-time earthquake then, too, that rattled the whole entire house. And I actually remember feeling that the earthquake almost propagated away from me. You could hear the trees shake with increasing distance away from my location. And that was the first substantial earthquake that I ever experienced. But this tornado here near Tipton, Oklahoma, and southwestern Oklahoma, there you can see the air cannons on top of Dominator 2. Those were compressed air cannons, so when we were inside the tornado, the compressor would pop up, we'd hit a big red button, and then shoot those parachute probes into the condensation funnel, and they'd get carried around inside, recording meteorological data, GPS data as well, getting tracked in real time. But the technology wasn't quite at a level back then where we could track those sensors and recover them, and they'd always malfunction. The engineering company that we worked with back then didn't quite come through on their end and getting those sensors to work, but it was just too early for trackable sensors to work. Now we've got Mark, Chase and Spin on Twitter, who's able to build these sensors with his own bare hands by himself, and now we're finally launching those trackable sensors into tornadoes and hurricanes. Of course, the coronavirus held us back a little bit this year, but here you can see Dominator 2 moving into intercept. We overshot the tornado a little bit, so we had to come back on this east-west road to get closer. and then the tornado moved off to our north, right out in the field. But really the whole point of the Dominators is to record data inside the tornado and to launch trackable sensors from our air cannons. And after Storm Chasers was canceled, had a decade-long struggle working mostly media. And just now, here over the last 3 years, we've finally been able to get our research back on track. And largely that's thanks to the Facebook supporter community, making our research possible, our live storm chasing possible, our air cannons, the subsonic sensor that we're deploying in the path of hurricanes, the new surginator or the storm surge sensor that we're hopefully going to deploy in the path of Delta. But this video here is a reminder that we've still got to watch for a tornado threat this fall season. There's usually a secondary max during October, November, even late September, or during the month of September as that jet stream migrates back south out of Canada, passes over the U.S., and then those waves or troughs of low pressure that will pass along that jet stream will lead to the development of these tornado outbreaks and the pumping northward of the moisture out ahead of them. But look at how textbook that structure is, looking north at that tornado that is moving away from us now at this point. And then we make a northward turn and try to get closer again. And then we saw what happened to Andy rolling his SUV there right next to this tornado. There you can see that large clear slot basically consolidating the vortex up there. A lot of hail still on the ground as well. And so now I'm going to show you a quick recap here of these monthly tornado statistics. These are pulled from the NCDC site here, and this is based on statistics 1991 to 2010, so not all the way to 2020. And one thing that I noticed with this plot is you can certainly see the single peak here from April, May, and June. It's interesting that July, now known as the new May, is up there. That doesn't factor in, however. These last 5 years or so in the high plains have been crazy during July. But you can see that there's not really a secondary peak during the fall season. And that's one problem with looking at these statistics for as a whole for the United States, is a lot of times it'll mask those little secondary peaks that might happen in Tornado Alley or Dixie Alley, whereas the rest of the country evens out, flattens out that curve. I think that a lot of these during September and August are due to hurricanes as well, especially 2004 and 2005. Ivan, for example, had over 100 tornadoes across the eastern U.S. So I think that really what happens if you look at Tornado Alley and Dixie Alley and isolate it is you probably do have a minimum during the late summer into the fall, especially if you include the high plains, which are often pretty active during July. And then I think there is a secondary peak in Tornado Alley and Dixie Alley right here during September, October, and November that happens. And if you break it down by state, which I'm going to do here, and by month, here is August, and then you're going to see the response there in Tornado Alley. You can see that there's not many tornadoes here across traditional Tornado Alley. Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, down into Texas, only 4 tornadoes down in Texas. You can see that Dixie Alley too is relatively quiet. I suspect that this number down here in Florida is likely due to hurricanes coming in since August is really the start of the heart of that tornado season. Colorado coming in with 6 tornadoes on average between 1991 and 2010 is kind of evidence that you could still get high plains insanity during August and July. Kind of surprised by this number in Wyoming, but I bet it's just due to underreporting of the tornadoes up there in that usually very active high plain state for tornadoes. And then you advance forward to September, and these are those numbers in September, and still not quite of an increase yet in Tornado Alley. That happens during October and November. You do have a little bit of an increase down here, Oklahoma and Texas. These states right here along the Gulf Coast, these are likely due to hurricanes during September. But the ramp up at Dixie Alley and tornadoes during November is definitely due to traditional tornado setups. But I expect that these are likely due to hurricane landfalls, which certainly is reducing the appearance of that secondary fall peak when you look at the nationwide plot month by month as well. And then in October, you're going to start to see that increase even more in traditional Tornado Alley, the Southern Plains, with that uptick in Texas and in Oklahoma. Late season hurricanes still contributing to a decent amount of tornadoes across Dixie Alley. But October is when the southern plains definitely get active. And remember last year during Dallas-Fort Worth, there were those damaging tornadoes downtown right around Halloween. Many of the more prolific southern plains tornadoes I've ever seen happen during October, including the first tornado I ever saw, October 4 of 1998. And the southern plains can also be active during November as well. And these stats are from the NCDC site. There you can see southern plains begin to come down a little bit in November, and Dixie Alley starts to ramp up, including Texas, this zone, Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama. A little bit of a decrease down in the southeast, but definitely an increase in Dixie Alley during November. And you may remember that one from 2013 in November that was incredibly active across the Midwest, including Illinois, Indiana, parts of Ohio. So a lot of times these average stats can really conceal exactly what's going on. But still, there is a secondary peak in tornadoes, and we've got to keep that in the back of our mind, especially after this pattern shift that looks to impact the region the middle of October on, which is a good thing for the western U.S. as well. So now I want to look at Gamma. That is still a tropical storm just off the northern tip of the Yucatan Peninsula. Still has a nice convective blob, decent spiral banding as well. Feeding into this tropical cyclone, it's pretty large as well. You can definitely see the appearance of dry air across the western half of the Gulf of Mexico. And if we look at visible satellite, you'll probably see a lot of fair weather cumulus out here associated with that continental air mass diving south through southern Mexico through the Bay of Tehuantepec earlier. Has led to a dry air mass out here in the western Gulf of Mexico. And that's definitely going to prevent Gamma from really intensifying. Most of the models show Gamma continuing to weaken. It's possible that it could reinvigorate a little bit here over the southern Gulf of Mexico, but the proximity to Mexico, to the Yucatan Peninsula, is going to help prevent further intensification. Also, this dry air that's over the western Gulf of Mexico has definitely limited intensification and continues to do so as we're going through the day today. And look at that, these speckled clouds right here, those are fair weather cumulus, low-topped cumulus, and they show a dry, relatively stable air mass in the deep layers, but you get low-level instability as the surface temperatures rise, and a little bit drier air aloft leads to the development of these cellular clouds. And that shows me that this western Gulf of Mexico is an environment that's not conducive for tropical storms, including Tropical Storm Gamma. But the existence of this tropical cyclone is almost going to act to modify the atmosphere over the Gulf of Mexico and make it more moist and more favorable for a Hurricane Delta to rapidly intensify once it passes the Yucatan or Cuba. But with that Bermuda High building into its north, there still is a chance that Delta could even curve west and impact Cozumel, Cancun. Maybe it could go further north and impact the Isle of Youth, passing over western Cuba. But anyone in the Gulf of Mexico, middle to end of next week, is going to have their eyes likely on Delta, which doesn't look very impressive this morning as a tropical wave, but that can change really quickly. You can see some nice spiral bands on visible satellite feeding into this tropical cyclone, feeding into that low pressure. Here's the inner core of it. And max sustained winds about 60 miles an hour, about 50 knots with this storm. But the model spread still meanders Gamma out into the southern Gulf of Mexico. Some of them even take it due north toward the central Gulf Coast as a stronger tropical cyclone. Others, though, a majority of them, take it right along the Mexican coastline and just weaken that tropical cyclone, but opening the door for a delta to really come through. So now let's look at the next wave that's coming up. The one that all eyes are going to be on. That could become a Hurricane Delta. Actually, this wave is really up in this region right there. You can see a little bit of convection trying to form here. But really, this wave does not look very impressive overall today. But I think we're going to see a big boost of the convection around that tropical wave, likely tonight during the tonight. Overnight, usually the convection blows up at night. And I do think that we're going to see a convective explosion with this wave, and it should dramatically get organized. But I think what's going to happen with Delta, and it's happened all season long, is it's just going to kind of just putz along, and then eventually once it passes into the Gulf of Mexico, at the last second I could see environmental conditions becoming more favorable, and then that storm even impacting portions of the central Gulf Coast. But anything can happen. It's so far out, it's very likely that there could be no impacts of tropical cyclones, but there is a decent chance that there also could be a pretty substantial impact. And that's why the National Hurricane Center has very high probabilities of this developing in the next 5 days. Could be as early as near the Jamaica area, but the wave is not looking very favorable so far this morning and today. So really, we just got to keep an eye on it. And here is the latest GFS Ensemble. This is actually from 6Z last night. I think there's even been some more. This is from the incredible Levi Cohen's website, tropicaltidbits.com. And you certainly don't want to get bogged down by any of these members or even get any panic, because anything can still happen. But this shows that the potential is definitely there for a significant tropical cyclone in the Gulf of Mexico. These reds and the darker ones are showing lower pressure type storms, and a lot of the members do show a pretty intense hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico next week. I think by the middle of next week, after about 72 hours, once the storm passes the Yucatan or the western tip of Cuba, that's when it could intensify. But these are just the GFS ensembles, just one model, and the GFS did a pretty good job with Gamma coming over the northern Yucatan, parking just offshore, and then kind of meandering into the Bay of Campeche. But Delta is going to be moving into an environment that is less dry. Right now, the whole western and northern Gulf of Mexico is still getting dominated by this dry air and those fair weather cumulus clouds. And then once Gamma meanders for a couple more days in the southern Gulf of Mexico, it'll act to moisten the environment across the central and northern Gulf of Mexico out ahead of Delta. And that's why I think that this could be a pretty significant tropical cyclone when it enters into the Gulf of Mexico. And the scary thing is that right now it looks like a majority of those model members are showing an arrival in the central Gulf Coast region. And this is a region that certainly does not need any more hurricanes. We had Laura come in here into southwestern Louisiana. We had Sally then come in and impact portions of the Alabama coast into the Florida Panhandle, including Pensacola Beach, Orange Beach, Gulf Shores. But there's still a lot of spread and a lot of uncertainty in these models as well. As I mentioned, Gamma is supposed to meander southwestward into the Bay of Campeche, staying pretty close to the coastline of Mexico as well, where there still are tropical storm warnings across the northern tip there of the Yucatan. But it's never expected to reach hurricane strength, and in fact it likely peaked already to the south of Cozumel just before making landfall near Tulum. And the official track slowly weakens Gamma and then brings it over here to potentially have a death in the Bay of Campeche toward the end of next week, as Delta might be tracking in to the Gulf of Mexico by that time. Here are some of those hurricane models from tropicaltidbits.com, and still shows that there's a lot of spread associated with Gamma, even though this is the official track right there. A couple of members still take this hurricane, or take this tropical cyclone due north, but these are outliers right here. Seems like the H-Wharf, some of these models are having Gamma get picked up by that trough that's exiting the east coast, but really it's likely going to miss out on that ticket to lift off to the north. That ridge will build in to its north as well. Then there's a potential of an intensifying delta that could be coming into the Gulf of Mexico. All these factors seem to point toward Gamma just drifting into the Bay of Campeche and potentially weakening out there, kind of in that drier air as well, pulling in that drier air from the western Gulf of Mexico. Still though, the GFS ensembles, at least the 6Z ones, still hint that a northward turn of Gamma is a possibility, and that's why we just got to keep watching this mess. Some of these GFS members even have a stronger storm. This outlier has been there for a long time. And there's still a lot of the GFS members that bury Gamma down into the Bay of Campeche. But all this shows is that we got to keep an eye on both Gamma and the tropical wave that is passing to the southwest of Hispaniola. So here's the general upper pattern. This is the 500 millibar pattern here. This is also from the operational GFS here. And this trough that's moving through, that's centered over the Great Lakes. There's a little streamer here, a potential vorticity streamer that extends off to the southwest as well. A little bit more moisture in the eastern Gulf of Mexico. So, some of those model outliers are predicting Gamma to get picked up by this trough and lifted off to the northeast, but looks like it's just not going to happen. This is the GFS forecast for Sunday morning. We advance to Monday morning, and look how that trough flattens out over the Bermuda High. Most of the flow is located on the east side of that system, showing that it reached its peak amplitude over the Great Lakes likely, and ejecting off the mid-Atlantic coast by Monday morning, likely leaving a Gamma behind somewhere in this region. And then you begin to get a westward expansion of this Bermuda High that's going to build across the northern Gulf of Mexico. And that's going to be a steering mechanism for a potential tropical cyclone Gamma that's coming in, which could develop from the wave that right now is located to the southwest of Hispaniola, somewhere in this area. And so this blocking ridge, usually when these ridges expand west like this, and this has happened a few times already this season, it'll cause a tropical cyclone to bend back to the west like that, which could bring it closer to the central Gulf Coast. This Bermuda High building to the west could help spare the western Florida coast, but if it doesn't build back as far west, then a weakness in that ridge could cause Delta to turn to the north and potentially even impact the west coast of Florida, similar to what a Hurricane Charlie did. And there's a chance that if this ridge is way strong and acts as a blocking mechanism for when this becomes a tropical cyclone, then it could even deflect a delta into the northern Yucatan. Cozumel, Cancun could be impacted by that. But at least the GFS shows delta, this trough bypassing delta, the Bermuda High expanding west, the lobe of the Bermuda High expanding west across the northern Gulf of Mexico, at least into the northeastern Gulf of Mexico, and then that would allow a steering of delta right into the central Gulf Coast. And if the Bermuda High builds way to the west, then there's a chance that even the Texas coast could be impacted by this. The point being, though, is that there's just a lot of uncertainty still in the models. Now we can go forward to Tuesday morning here. There you can see that Bermuda High expands further west according to the GFS across the northern Gulf of Mexico. Still waiting, excited for the 12Z GFS runs and the 12Z European. But this shows that after this system flattens out, very progressive system after it moves off the mid-Atlantic, gets dominated by this Bermuda High, flattens out, loses all its flow in the backside, basically opens the door for a westward expansion of that anticyclone into the north central Gulf of Mexico. Here you can see the potential of a tropical cyclone delta there. It may not even be, it still could be a tropical wave by this point, but it's possible that this anticyclone to the north of it could act to block and then take a further south track right between the gateway of the Yucatan and Cuba, and then around the western side of that lobe of the Bermuda High into the central Gulf Coast. But again, that's Tuesday morning. It's only one model. And that's exactly what happens in the 6Z GFS. But we're basically going to be analyzing every single model run from here on out. There's going to be a windshield wiper effect, as we call it. But here you can see the GFS picking up on a delta, dominating in the central or northern Gulf Coast by about Thursday morning. So late next week into the weekend, there could be a potential impact of a tropical cyclone delta along the Gulf Coast. And a lot of that is because of this dominance of the Bermuda High in the Atlantic. And these troughs really are amplifying or carving into it at all. They're flattening out, lifting off to the north, and allowing this Bermuda High to continue to build to the west, act as a blocking pattern. And any of these tropical cyclones that get going in the western Caribbean or the Gulf have the potential to lift north on the western side of that Bermuda High and then potentially impact the Gulf Coast. But I'm excited to see what the 12Z GFS is also going to show. Looking at 500 millibar vorticity here, you could really see this is the polar front jet. This is the system that is likely going to fail to pick up gamma. Very flat, fast-moving system by the time it gets over the northern Atlantic. Here's a potential developing tropical cyclone gamma there to the west of Jamaica, closing in on western Cuba. And then you've got this Bermuda high. Impenetrable, dominant Bermuda high there, just off the southeastern U.S., but this low building into the west after this system ejects off to the northeast. And the GFS even shows a tropical cyclone getting going there in the eastern tropical Pacific on the other side of Mexico associated with this pattern. So a lot to focus on here as we move forward. This is just one scenario. The European model does take a further south track with a stronger Bermuda high off to the north. But all of these things we need to watch as Delta is definitely getting a lot closer to Jamaica. Well, right now it's a tropical wave, and in fact a very disorganized tropical wave. But definitely something that we need to keep an eye out because it does have the potential to move into the Gulf, which has proven to be a very volatile basin, body of water so far. And look at this too. You could definitely see up here in the Gulf of Mexico. Notice how all that convection is in the eastern side of the Gulf of Mexico. Much more moist of an atmosphere here. This side of the Gulf is extremely dry. Fair weather cumulus dominating it. But it looks like a lot of rain is heading toward portions of the Florida coast here, including the west coast of Florida. Water spout potential there too as well. Southwestern Florida. But gamma just moving very slowly down here to the south. That trough picking up some of these high clouds, getting thrown out off to the northeast. Potential vorticity streamer there. But it really looks like it's going to leave gamma behind, and gamma is going to meander off to the southwest and potentially dissipate in the Bay of Campeche. So I'm going to continue these live updates. I hope you guys enjoy my weather reports. We'll continue breaking down the potential for Delta. Very likely I'm going to have to leave early next week with Dominator 4 to intercept this storm. Hopefully the Surgeonator is going to be ready. I'm definitely going to have to work out logistics on where to ship the Surgeonator. Mark is working non-stop this entire weekend, and he has been for weeks trying to build that Surgeonator. He's going to code the software for it. We're hopefully going to have live streaming data of the storm surge, regardless of what happens in terms of these tropical cyclones. But thank you, everybody. Please check out the Facebook supporter community. Makes live storm chasing and these live briefings possible. I really appreciate everybody here, and I hope you guys enjoy my weather reports.